Well, brothers, I thought it'd be good for us to talk a little bit about hymns, sort of generally. What's attracted each of us to hymns? We've all made a significant investment of months and years into rewriting hymns, reintroducing people to hymns. It might be good to talk a little bit about why we think that's a valuable project and a valuable investment.
I think one of the things that's attracted me to the hymns, I work with college students as a pastor to college students, and one of the things I'm really concerned about is they understand that the church is not just a passing fad, that the church is bigger than people that think like them and speak like them. And so putting the words of saints who've lived hundreds of years before, who thought differently about things like suffering and the gospel in some ways than a lot of modern people do, is really valuable.
You know, when I was growing up, I grew up in a broadly evangelical church, and the way that my church treated worship culture was to kind of divide everybody into their little groups. You know, so the junior high program had their own worship program, and the high schoolers had their own worship program, and the college students, and so on and so forth. And so the whole time I was growing up, it really reinforced to me this idea that worship is basically a way for me to express myself before the Lord. And it was really a powerful thing to me around the time I went to college, and I started going to a church it was a very multi-generational church. I started going to a church that had all of its worship together. They didn't have separate worship programs, and that was mostly around hymns, because they were it was this particular kind of music that people in their teens, people in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s and much older could all get behind. And even now at the church that I work at, we have a nursing home worship program where every Tuesday our worship teams go around and sing at nursing homes. And it's been such a benefit to our young people, even as they say, well, what do you guys want to sing? People raise their hands, and as you can imagine, they don't ask for things for the latest hits. Right. They don't ask for the freshest cuts. They're asking for things that have been dear to them for a long time.
Yeah, I've never done a funeral that didn't include hymns.
Yeah. It's funny for us, we kind of came to hymns through sort of the back door, because we were definitely more in sort of the contemporary worship stream when Sojourn was planted. And we kept sort of running into these roadblocks when we were trying to find songs that were resonant with the language of the Psalms and resonant with experiences of suffering or experiences of confession and lament. And so that ultimately sort of led us on this road where we discovered Sandra McCracken kind of before we discovered Indelible Grace even, and which through Sandra led us to you guys, which led us back to the hymnal. And I think for us it's been an interesting thing, because it was like the other piece of it was the creative piece, which was we wanted to write original material, music that, you know, the music itself sort of sounded like our church and sounded like our people. But we wanted to write with content and depth, and we realized, you know, we're 20 years old. Like, we don't have a lot to say. And there's all these saints that have gone before who've said it so well. And there's this sort of tradition of it's okay to rewrite, it's okay to retune.
Right.
Maybe we could talk about that a little bit, the retuning. Like, have you run into objections, you know, for the fact, like, how dare you mess with this? Yeah. And how do you feel about that? I mean, you've done some arrangements that were not retuned. They were, you know, just. How do you measure that? How do you discern whether that's valuable to retune and not to?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. One of the things we talk about at our church a lot is the priority of corporate singing, and this idea that you know, fundamentally these hymns are in many ways poems. Like, in many ways it really is about the lyrics, but at the same time our purpose for them is for corporate worship. So the priority to me is always that the text and the emotion that's being stirred actually mesh together in a way that people can sing together. And so sometimes, really and many times in our congregation, that means just small tweaks. A lot of times that means us doing something harmonically to a hymn, doing something to sort of give it more of a lift or to give it a little more gravity at times. But then, you know, there are certainly times when you find a beautiful text where the tune that is familiar to people maybe just really is not adequate to express it. And in those times, I think that it's a great practice to sort of cultivate in our congregations the ability to see the beauty and the value of the text and to give new life to it.
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah, I like to tell people that, Indelible Grace Music is not out to deconstruct church music. Very few cases where we knew there was a tune, a good serviceable tune, and we decided we don't like that tune, we want to rewrite it. I actually came to so many of those texts through old 19th century hymnals that I have, which only print the words. And I was in a church where we rarely sang hymns. If we did, it was sort of the top 10 most popular ones. So there was a few cases like Arise, My Soul, Arise. I knew the tune that was in the hymnal that we used. I didn't think it was a good fit. But in general, what I've tried to do is find texts that have dropped out of use that nobody has emotional attachment to, because I'm not out to just upset people. But I want people to sing a text like Dear Refuge in My Weary Soul. It hasn't been in a hymnal for 100 years.
Sure.
So let's find a tune that works. But I would say this too. Every text, I believe, has more emotional range and nuance than any one tune can fully capture. And so even when there's a good, familiar tune, at times, again, without stretching people so far that they break, it can be beneficial sometimes to introduce a new tune that helps them hear the words all over again.
My wife and I talk about this pretty regularly because, your background and the way you grew up worshiping has so much to do with your experience of these songs. So I grew up in a church where I didn't know a lot of these hymns, and I discovered them in college. My wife grew up in a very conservative church where she sings alto lines, in her sleep. She knows all of these hymns. And so for her at times, she gets a little frustrated where she feels like, oh, well, if people love these hymns, they ought to just teach them from the hymnal.
Right.
And really, why are we, creating this confusion? And one of the things that we talk about sometimes that I do think is important for a lot of hymn lovers to sort of recognize, because I studied hymnody in college and have a great love for what's actually in the hymnal. But that so many of these folks that you get in your college ministry, a lot of the folks that we get walking into our church doors, have never heard any of these hymns at all. I mean, we have people at my church that even for very familiar songs like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross show up and say, can I get a copy of that somewhere? That are really just hearing these things for the first time. I think that,
It's amazing.
with this whole last 30 or 40 years that have seen such a decline in the use of the hymnal in evangelical churches means that a lot of people are really hearing these hymns for the first time through the work that Kevin is doing with Indelible Grace, through the work that a lot of these churches are doing resetting the hymns.
I tell people sometimes I found this sign in an antique store that said, my grandmother saved it, my mother threw it away, and now I'm buying it back. And that's what I feel a lot of these young people are doing. And a lot of them are saying, why didn't we know these songs?
Right.
Look at these songs. And so it's been really exciting.
Well, and I'll throw one more sort of perspective in on it that I think is helpful too and it's an argument for the retuning of the hymns, which is I sort of grew up on the other side of that. I grew up in Baptist churches, grew up very much singing from the hymnal, being immersed in that culture, and for me and a lot of my friends that grew up in similar places, the concept of singing hymns, of opening the hymnal, of singing those kind of square melodies, all the cultural baggage that came with that. Because we didn't necessarily come out of great gospel preaching churches necessarily. We came out of sort of the moralistic experience of North American Christianity, and so for some people, I think there's a cultural baggage that goes with the music, and I think that's a sort of fascinating reality. There's people who come into the church and say, I can't worship with rock and roll.
Right.
And it's their conscience is just going, this brings up too many bad moral memories. I think the same thing happens for people who grew up in moralistic churches and never heard the gospel. They hear the gospel afresh, but when they hear those old songs,
the organ or whatever,
it brings back all that cultural baggage.
It sure does. Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that every musical style has cultural baggage attached to it. I think one of the ironies for me, and I'm in a church now in East Nashville, it's a very racially, economically diverse place, and thinking about using hymns, and one of the ironies that I've discovered is that people like Isaac Watts, William Cooper, some of these great hymn writers deliberately tone down their poetry to the level of the poor and the unlearned, really. And yet, so many of those texts are set to musical styles that are associated with the upper class.
Right.
Now, it's not saying that those tunes are bad, but that's just an interesting development. So.
Well, I think it's a fascinating movement that's going on, and it's a joy for us to be a part of it. And it reminds me, I mean, when I think about like how different the three of us are and how different what we do musically is, that at the end of the day, there's this incredible pastoral priority that we all have, where when we sing hymns, when we sing these songs, we're putting words in people's mouths.
Right.
And there's no other opportunity to do that. Like there's nothing else that we do really in life in general where somebody else is putting words into our mouth. So it's a profound task, and I'm blessed by what both of you guys are doing and encouraged by that, and very thankful for you guys.
Yeah, likewise.